Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome back, everyone, to our Dhamma talk period of the Day of Mindfulness. So I hope you all have been having a good practice day. It's been a pretty good day for me, too. I noticed something this morning when I woke up. I started actually thinking about this Day of Mindfulness session that we were going to do, and I started thinking about what I was going to say. And then I thought, oh, I'm not really supposed to think about what I'm going to say. I'm just supposed to say something. And then it came back again later, this thought about kind of worrying about my personal future. You know, like if I'm not prepared for the Dhamma talk and I don't give a good Dhamma talk, you know, whatever will people think of me? You know, they'll think I'm an idiot. And other thoughts like that. So this sort of thing I notice is coming up and going away in my mind, and I recognize it as a long-standing element or facet of my personality. In Buddhist psychology, I'm an aversion type, or sometimes maybe called a fear type or anxiety type. And you know, I have a lot of company. About I don't know, 50% of the people that you'll meet, maybe more, are aversion or anxiety types. And certainly true in Buddhist monasteries. We often come to the monastery because of suffering, and we're driven by the desire to escape. And we see the opportunity, the possibility of escaping suffering in the Buddha's Dhamma. And our aversion propels us. So actually, you could say in a way, our personality is serving us in that regard. It's not just all bad. You know, we're taking our personalities, actually ends up being part of the motivation that brings us to Dhamma practice. And the same could be said for greed types. That greed types will you know, they'll experience greed. They'll experience the downside of the suffering that's associated with getting and losing things, because that's what greed does. It tends to propel a kind of a consumer attitude towards the world, and they'll sense the futility or the hopelessness in it, the inability to actually ever satisfy greed. Just like the fear types and anxiety types experience the futility and the inability to ever satisfy fear, to ever experience a sense of safety that's somehow undisturbable. Like to finally arrive at perfect safety is what fear types want. And to finally arrive at complete contentment is what greed types want. And what delusion types want typically is to finally know what's going on, right? Rather than sort of feeling like I'm not quite sure what's the heck's going on, or I'm kind of half asleep and I don't really get it, to finally feel like they're in the know and that everything is seen correctly, seen perfectly, and that there's no sense of fogginess or vagueness or uncertainty, and so then they can relax. So our personality types, and there's these three types: the greed type, the hatred type, and the delusion type. And really, the delusion type is the only type there really is. The other two are just variations on that theme. You know, greed is a variation of delusion. Aversion is a variation of delusion. All three of these types are grounded in a misperception of the truth of the way things really are. So that's kind of the background that I'm coming at this feeling that was happening in my personality of being anxious about this Dhamma talk. What am I going to say? So I kept resisting the impulse to prepare things. Towards the end there, I kind of said, well, maybe I'll just look at a couple of suttas. So I'll have something, you know. So it's kind of like a security blanket thing. I actually had a security blanket when I was a kid. Do you remember like the Charlie Brown comic strip with the character named Linus? He was always walking around with his security blanket, and my older brothers found it great amusement to like hide my blanket from me when I was 3 years old or however it was. So early on, I was kind of grasping at things to give me a sense of security. And there's another example of my mind grasping at, even in this case, grasping at suttas to give me some sense of security so that I can face the horrible danger of this Dhamma talk, like the sense of threat that you people in Toronto all present to me. like somehow something could go wrong here. That's and the absurdity of it, the ludicrousness of it, doesn't necessarily change the inner feeling of like, you know, oh no, I better do something to be ready, to be prepared. And naturally, anything like this in our personality gets reinforced over time. So if you're an anxiety type and your anxiety propels you to do things like really be careful about doing your homework, turning in all your assignments, being, you know, it can make you behave in a very responsible and meticulous way. And this gets rewarded in our society. We get rewarded for being a fear type, you could say. You get acknowledgement, recognition, promotions, appreciation for being careful, being, you know, sort of worrying about the future, thinking about all the details, and being prepared for anything that might go wrong. But what it does is it also limits your spontaneity, your ability to simply be okay with the way things are, to be in the moment. And it obscures some of the other aspects of your personality that might be very beneficial, useful, fun, enjoyable by people that might also get appreciation. And the artifice of trying to control the outcome of your world, because you're coming at it from a place of anxiety, can make the experience of the world be sort of joyless. Like you can't really enjoy yourself because you're always worrying about what might go wrong. So there's this downside to the anxiety type, just like there's a downside for the greed type, and there's a downside for the delusion type. Even if you figure out how to manage your type well enough to succeed in the ordinary world, and you know, as adults, we all of us manage to somehow adjust to being the type that we are, and we find some way of being in the world that's more or less successful. We form relationships. We find, you know, some kind of work to do, and we make it to adulthood. And you know, but we might be very neurotic. We might be suffering in all kinds of different ways because of the downsides of this personality that we're bound to bear. So what the Dhamma is trying to show us, one way of considering Dhamma practice, is to help you see the truth about this personality that we think that we are. So whatever kind of type that you are, rather than saying, you know, like I'm an aversion type, and identifying with it and allowing that to define who you are. So I'm an aversion type, so I can never sort of be playful and have fun and enjoy myself because it's too scary. Even if I've had experiences where that seems to be true, freedom from that is actually very desirable, to feel like that's no longer a boundary on my experience of human life. And so a sense that there's nothing to worry about, that everything's okay, that I don't need to spend an inordinate amount of time planning every nuance of my future so that I can be safe as I traverse the terrain of the unknown. You know, if I could somehow set that aside and not let that constantly dictate how I use my energy, that would be a huge relief. And of course, it would be a huge relief, and sometimes when it happens, it is a huge relief. So our intuition about what it is that's our life problem can be wrong if we take our personality too literally. If we think that security in the world, or contentment in the world, or truth in the world is somehow going to come from getting what we want, sort of being able to arrange everything so that we can predict it, or being able to get all the experiences and people and possessions that we might want, or to sort of gather all the knowledge, or master all the expertise that will allow us to rest in certainty. The focus towards the outside world is where the futility lies. So it's kind of a rigged game. As long as you're trying to make the outside world somehow manipulated to give you what you want, to provide you with with safety or comfort or fulfillment or certainty, it's inherently going to disappoint you. And by now you probably know this, at least intellectually. The problem is the intellectual appreciation of this truth is somehow insufficient. So we might all know that our personality is somehow incomplete, that it's not. We might have heard that that there's no self to be found in form or feeling or perception, mental formations or consciousness. We might have heard that, and we might understand it intellectually, but what we really need to do is understand it in a very visceral way, a kind of, Lumpur Sumedho calls it intuitive wisdom or intuitive knowledge. And another way of considering it is to see it as the actual truth, the irrefutable present moment truth of the way things are. So rather than the way we think they are, or that we've heard that they are, somehow we need to see how they really actually are. And that's where Buddhist practice comes in. So my personality drove me to Buddhism, and it eventually drove me to becoming, you could say, a monk. Could say it drove me to be a monk. It certainly helped. In monasteries, you run into a lot more anxiety types than you do, or aversion types than you do greed types. There's not that much to be greedy about in the monastery. But you run into a few. There's a few here. They're very amusing. But aversion types are more common. And like them, I'm here. My practice is motivated by this sense of unsatisfactoriness of the world. And my intuitive understanding, my recognition that my usual strategy was very limited. Like I could get some degree of comfort, some degree of satisfaction by arranging things just the way that I thought would give me the most certainty about how things were going to turn out. But every time something went a little bit wrong, of course, my anxiety would come back up again. And eventually I recognized that there's no other way for it to be. Like the world's just not predictable enough for me to find a course through it that would give me a sense of safety and security all the way to the end. Because, I mean, even the very end itself is going to be very anxiety provoking, right? And death is not a very comforting thought. So even if I can make myself safe and comfortable now, I can't guarantee that I'll be able to do it when it's time to die. Or face death, when death is staring you in the face, or when you're struck with a mortal illness, or you lose something that you really love, so your spouse or your children or your friends, your parents. We all have to face this loss that life is going to present us with. Whether we're a greed type, a delusion type, or an aversion type, those losses are painful and they're uncontrollable. You can't stop them from happening. So this recognition comes out of reflection, out of simple observation. Really, we see that it's true. We've heard it before. When you hear it when you're a kid, you can't quite believe it. Like you kind of know that you're going to die, but when you're a child or when you're a young adult, it seems like that's such a remote thing, and you don't really have to think about it at all. And then as time goes by, it starts to become more and more real to you as you see people around you dying, as you recognize your own body aging and losing its vitality. It's hard to continue ignoring that truth. And yet people do. People are quite capable of pretending like they're still, a young adult, even into their 70s and 80s. They still try to pretend that nothing's going wrong here, everything's okay. Even though their bodies are falling apart left and right. They can still maintain some kind of illusion or delusion that death happens to other people. It's not something that's going to happen to me. They manage to avoid thinking about it. But in the end, of course, death wins in that kind of a battle. So when our natural attention to our life informs us enough about the futility or the unworkability of achieving full happiness, achieving a sense of comfort and contentment by manipulating the exterior, then we start to look for something else. And this is, the Buddha called this the search. So whenever a person is touched by suffering, one of two things will happen. That person will either change course and do something which will eventually lead to even more suffering. So this is the search for satisfaction in the world. You keep trying to change things or arrange things or get things that are going to make you feel happy. Or eventually they'll realize the futility of that, and they'll say, well, what can I do to alleviate this unsatisfactoriness or this suffering, rather than just create more suffering, right? Who can possibly give me a word of wisdom that would allow me to find my way out of this mass of suffering? So that's what the Dhamma is conveying to us, is this possibility of finding our way out of this mass of suffering. And when you really hear it, then it can change your life. I mean, it's quite a beacon to understand that the ordinary way of pursuing happiness really is actually futile. Right? It's kind of what do they call it? It's an acknowledgement of a truth which lightens your own burden because you feel like you're not alone. Right? So there's kind of a validation, pointing out very clearly and unambiguously that life is characterized by unsatisfactoriness. That's the truth. It just isn't. There's no other way for it to be. It's not like everybody else is living their life properly and they're all happy and content, and somehow you are uniquely miserable. It's just that everybody has this suffering, and we're all more or less skilled at not showing it to the rest of the world. We don't go around complaining all the time, or ideally, about our unsatisfactoriness. But it tends to haunt our heart, and we keep finding ourselves stuck in these loops of habitual action, like me thinking that somehow by reading suttas, I can prepare myself for this unknown future of having to give a Dhamma talk, right? This is just a habit of the psyche that we take to be a good advice. Like, if I do this, then I'll be okay, right? There's this kind of built-in logic to these promptings that we have in our personality. And there's a large variety of them, but they're all fundamentally grounded in the same mistaken belief that somehow I'm able to manipulate circumstances to bring about comfort, safety, satisfaction, ease, and peace. So that I don't have to worry, so I can relax. So everything will be okay. So it's important to actually try to bring this into your life, right? Hearing about it and maybe seeing it upon reflection when you're sitting on the cushion. These are very important. And this is where you have to start, is to hear about this sort of thing start to see how it's true also for your own life, for your own mind, your own heart, that these same sorts of forces are operating in you too. The Buddha recognized it operating in his psyche, and all the great teachers have recognized it operating in them. And this is what the Buddha is calling the first noble truth, that life is characterized by unsatisfactoriness. And the second noble truth, that the cause of the unsatisfactoriness is grasping, right? So that's what I mean by the habit that's trying to make you safe. The habit that's trying to make you get what you want, that's going to make you satisfied, that's the habit that somehow seems to promise something good in exchange for you doing something now to manipulate your circumstances. So whether it's trying to make yourself safe by preparing ahead of time for something that you're not totally certain about, or to get someone to like you by turning on the charm, or try to make a whole bunch of money in the stock market by trying to time the market, or whatever it is that you're doing that you've learned can work sometimes to some degree. The tendency to just fall for the habit is grasping. We're kind of grasping at this possibility of at least an ephemeral kind of happiness. When I say that, I'm reminded of a Simpson episode. I used to watch The Simpsons, one of my favorite television shows at one time. And Homer Simpson is like sitting in the bar, and he says, he picks up a tankard of beer, and he says, beer, there's a temporary solution that I can get behind. So he's acknowledging that it's a temporary solution, and of course it's a solution to whatever suffering that Homer Simpson's putting up with. And we, on the other hand, have to put up with suffering without being able necessarily to drink our way out of it. I mean, or at least not for very long. So the second noble truth about grasping is this noble truth that when we're touched by suffering, our habitual reaction is to grasp at more strategies to get out of it somehow. And the grasping itself is actually part of what generates the unsatisfactoriness. And this is the linkage that most of our Buddhist practice is trying to help us see. So the first part, where we're trying to see the nature of suffering itself, the nature of unsatisfactoriness itself, the first noble truth, there's a lot of examples. We can certainly think of a lot of examples in our own life. The Buddha uses this sort of standard list of, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Not to get what one wants is dukkha. To be associated with what one dislikes is dukkha. To lose what one loves is dukkha. In brief, the 5 aggregates of clinging are dukkha. Unsatisfactoriness. So anything that the mind grasps at or clings at or tries to manipulate or tries to control or gets involved with, one way or another, is part of this aggregate of clinging. It's the aggregate of grasping at or trying to control, trying to manipulate, taking as possessing the possibility of yielding happiness. It's another way of looking at it. And the Buddha calls this an inversion of perception. If you really see clearly that, for example, exercising and diet and makeup and fancy haircuts, etc., can make you look a little better, but they can't really make you safe. They can't make you live forever. You recognize the futility of it. Then, when in the recognition of that futility, you don't necessarily have to abandon all those things. And just sort of let everything go to pot. But you can sort of see that it's a very limited response to the aging process, and it might give you some comfort, might give you some more physical flexibility and strength in your old age. It might make life more pleasant for the people who have to look at you, but in the end, it won't stave off death. And so when you recognize it, that's like a mature understanding of the limitations of this thing, and of sort of self-care, self-beautification, concern about the appearance and health of the body. There's nothing wrong. There's no moral downside to caring about it. But there's no salvation in it either. And when we let ourselves contemplate this, when we actually take it into our mind and think about it, and we see clearly limitations of that strategy to give us, then we'll have kind of the right relationship to it. We can let go of the clinging to those things. So we don't have to go to the gym habitually. We don't have to worry about beautification all the time. We can just sort of do it as part of our routine and recognize its limitations, and then we can sort of live with it. It can be part of our life without dominating our life or causing us undue difficulty. And if it's time to let it go, we can let it go without a thought, because we're not taking it that seriously. We're just using it in a limited way for what it's good for. Like taking a taxi. You hail a taxi, you get in, and you tell them where you want to go, and when you get out, the taxi leaves, and that's it. You never took possession of the taxi. You just used it for what it's good for, and recognizing its limitations, its costs, and its alternatives. So when we're using our Dhamma practice correctly, we calm the mind, we meditate, we look at our lives, we look at it, the way our mind responds to stress, we consider the kinds of things that cause us suffering, and we examine these kinds of questions that the Buddha suggests regarding things like what's wholesome and what's unwholesome. We try to understand in our direct experience, what is clinging, what is suffering, what is my suffering, what is my unsatisfactoriness, and how is it that my mind is clinging to things? How does this lead to unsatisfactoriness? When we can actually see to a minor degree or to a major degree, to whatever degree that we can, when we can see the linkage between the way our mind grasps at things and the suffering that maybe not even use the word suffering, the unsatisfactoriness of that strategy, its futility, say, or its inevitable unfulfilling result, then we're coming into what's called right view. We start to understand the cause and effect. And unfortunately, you can't just understand cause and effect just once. You can't hear it in a Dhamma talk and then you understand it forever. You actually have to see it over and over and over again in every nuance and aspect of your life, of your mental life, and of your life interacting with others. So it takes a while. You can't really be in a hurry. But the principle is not that difficult, and you can see it. But when you've seen it on a small scale, it's easier to sort of scale it up and see it in other aspects of your life. So going back to my example, now here I'm thinking, oh, maybe I should look at some suttas to prepare for my Dhamma talk. At a certain point, I said, well, I know that this is just a habit of the mind, grasping at some kind of security blanket in order to make myself feel comfortable doing this thing which I find provocative of anxiety, doing public speaking. And I know that if I were to, if I read, 100 suttas or something, maybe that would feel like I've done enough and I can really sit down with confidence and know that I'll have something worthwhile to say. But what if I forget? Maybe I should take notes. I can sort of see that the mind going down that path could only generate even more anxiety, feel like there's more that I could do to make myself safe. So there isn't, I can see the futility of that pursuit. And when I see it, I kind of come back to my Dhamma practice. I recognize, oh yeah, this is what the Buddha is talking about. That's the mind clinging at something. When you see clinging, there's a possibility that you can try out the third noble truth. Right? So in this case, seeing that the mind is tending to go down this habitual route of trying to make itself safe by doing all kinds of preparation for something that's anxiety provoking excessively. And there's nothing wrong with ordinary preparation for, say, a journey or for a meeting or whatever. These are things that we have to do. But I could see the dysfunctional aspect of this habit of my mind because I've been cohabitating with it for so long. So when I recognize this, I go, okay, I trust the Buddha. I trust the teaching. I think he's right. I've seen it before. I know how this works. I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to face the fact that there's anxiety. And there's this like a pain in the psyche, an anxiety about my public speaking appointment. And, or, it could be anything, going to the dentist, meeting someone new, whatever the anxiety is that comes up. When you're looking at anxiety that way, you're attending to it more as a here and now phenomenon. So feeling my own anxiety, it feels kind of diffuse as a kind of a pressure or a tension in various places in my body, mostly around my head and shoulders, and a tightness in my chest. So this is the way the anxiety is presenting physically. And then the mental story about it has like images of something like being blamed or shame or something like that. So there's very subtle mental images that kind of flash in when I really consider, what is it that I'm worried about? Why is this anxiety here? What's the anxiety about? And so I can see that these things have deep, deep roots in my history, my conditioning, and that they're not necessarily true. Like that no matter how bad of a Dhamma talk I give, maybe or how good of a Dhamma talk I might give, hey, maybe the internet will cut out and that'll be the end of it. Like this has happened before. So I can't actually predict how things are going to go. I can't control how things are going to go. And really, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen, you guys wouldn't be impressed. Well, okay. We'll all live through that, right? I'll live through that. It'll be okay. So I can see with mature reflection that my anxiety is both normal because of its conditioning and because of the circumstances are triggering it, and exaggerated. Like it's I'm worried about something which really isn't that big of a deal. So when we do this, we get a little bit of perspective on our emotional reactions to things. So if we're averse to something, if we're disliking something, if we're judging something, if we're rejecting something, or if we're greedy for something, we want something, we feel like we need something, we're yearning for something, we can always have this possibility of recognizing, that itself, that feeling is unsatisfactoriness. That's what the Buddha is talking about. This push or this pull to get rid of something or to get something. That itself is the feeling of unsatisfactoriness. And if we look at that very carefully, the feeling of unsatisfactoriness, it's dependently arisen. It depends on a lot of conditions for it to come about. So in this case, my anxiety comes from give a public talk. And I've experienced in my past difficulties in doing this, maybe nervousness, freezing up, people making fun of me, etc. And so I might expect that this anxiety is a normal part of the psyche, just like pain in your knee. If you sit on the cushion for long enough, you're going to feel pain. The circumstances provoke it, but it doesn't mean that it somehow demands that I do anything about it. It's just there. It's just part of the weather. It's like today it's rainy. So what? We don't necessarily have to do anything just because we're feeling anxious or we're feeling needy or greedy or wanting or whatever it is that we're feeling. We just feel the feeling. We just know the thoughts. We just experience the state. And when we do that, or in this case, when I did that, when I just kind of said, okay, what's going on? What do I feel? What am I thinking? Why is this here? This kind of magic thing happens where I see the connection between my thinking about it and the feeling of anxiety itself. If I'm not thinking about it, like when I'm, scarfing down my lunch, if I'm not thinking about it, I don't taste it. But when I pay attention to my lunch, I really can taste all the texture. I can feel the textures. I can taste all the tastes. And when I'm doing that, there's no anxiety about my future speech, right? So the sensation of anxiety itself is just a conditioned arising, which breaks apart as soon as I stop attending to it. So it's my attending to it is somehow helping it sustain itself. So the kind of attending that the Buddha recommends is one that's more more dispassionate, less believing its story, more kind of objective, you could say, equanimous. When we feel the feeling in the present moment and we see how it's connected to our thoughts, and we ask ourselves if we can just let it go. So in this case, I say, well, okay, I'm gonna try it. I'm just gonna go in cold, no suttas, no safety net, no preparation. See what happens. Because of my faith, because of my experience, because of my trust, because of my practice. As soon as I do that, then the tension of that just kind of drops away. There's a little maybe butterfly of anxiety that comes up over and over again, but it's not the same sort of like network of thoughts, feelings, actions, perceptions, feeding back into even more actions and feelings, so that I don't get stuck in this loop of constantly feeding the anxiety. And then all I have to do is deal with an occasional little butterfly that comes up, and that's it. And then eventually here I am giving the talk, everything's going okay. And soon enough it'll be over, and then that whole thing will have passed as an episode. So the principle of the third noble truth is something we have to experience for ourselves. We have to use our actual life experiences of greed, of aversion, of delusion, of habit, of deep pathways ground into our psyches that we do over and over again, that aren't very, one way or another, aren't fully functional. We have to look at our own suffering. We have to see what it is that we're doing that's propagating or perpetuating our suffering. And then we have to see if we can let it go. When you let go a little bit, you'll experience a little bit of relief. And that's very important to pay attention to. When you pay attention to the relief aspect of letting go, then you start to retrain your mind. Instead of believing in the mind's projections into the future about how if I do these things, then I'll get something that I want. I'll be able to control my circumstances, or I'll be able to obtain the valued thing that I want. Instead of believing that, we start to believing our present moment experience, which is that when I let go of my habitual tendency to grasp, in that very moment, there's something calming and peaceful and more satisfying, right? And then we're experiencing the cessation of suffering. So we're actually seeing for ourselves in our own practice the third noble truth. Not just as something that we recite or that we believe, but as something which is actually true here and now. This is something the Buddha talked about a number of times, about this principle of the Dhamma, the truth of the Dhamma. It's the kind of truth that's really only, it requires very careful attention in order to see it. And you can only see it in the present moment. The truth of the Dhamma isn't true in the past. It's not true in the future. It's true now, always just right now. So you have to see the truth yourself in the present moment, in your own mind, in your own life. When you see the third noble truth, this is where you're retraining your mind. You're changing the way that you perceive the circumstances of your life. Ideally, whenever some kind of unpleasantness or disturbance touches your mind because of contact, instead of reactively reaching habitually to either grab it or push it away or ignore it, instead of having some kind of reaction to it, we recognize that that's what's happening, and that if I don't grasp at it, I just allow it to be the way it is, it will pass away all by itself, and I'll continue to be at ease, undisturbed, and peaceful and happy, content. This is the happiness that the Buddha's talking about. The happiness of liberation isn't sort of joyful, giddy, gleeful, excitement kind of happiness of getting what you want. It's more the peace and the ease of finding everything just okay, just perfect, just the way it is, not needing things to be any different, and being actually content, even happy, even feeling a sense of bliss with even difficulty, even anxiety can be something which is just there and it's still okay. Nothing needs to change in order for me to be at ease when the mind is seeing correctly, but it can only see correctly right now, right? If you're thinking you're missing it now, but you'll get it later, you really try to do is bring your practice into your present moment, into your actual life, into your actual circumstances as best you can. And the more you do this, the more you train your mind this way, the easier it becomes. It's like any other kind of practice that you've ever done. Practice makes perfect. We get better at things as we do it over and over again. We start to see more and more applications of the principle. And eventually we arrive at a place where, for the most part, most of the time, we react to the events of our day with a sense of balance and comportment and appropriateness and easefulness. We don't get upset about things. We don't have a negative reaction or excessively positive reaction to anything. And then we're kind of more available then to because we're not caught up in our mental processing of trying to get rid of or get. We have even more mental capacity to simply know what's going on. We can actually attend more fully to the suffering of others. We can be more available to help out, make the world a better place. And when there's something that requires our intelligence and our diligence, there's more of us available to do it. We're not being somehow undermined by the habits of our mind, because we've retrained our mind. We're retraining our mind. We're making our mind, in effect, more efficient. It's no longer caught up in worry about the future, regret over the past, trying to get rid of things, trying to get things. That all takes energy. It all takes time. It all takes mental processing. So when these things start to get let go of, again, you get into this kind of a virtuous cycle. You see that letting go leads to ease and comfort. Ease and comfort feels good. So then makes letting go the next time a little bit easier. And the ease and the comfort puts you in a place where, again, you're more effective as a human being. You're more effective emotionally, you're more effective mentally, because you're not worried about yourself so much. You're not worried about your future and your past. You're not worried about what other people are going to think of you. You're just being here and what's actually happening right now. And so the way that we get there, the final kind of way that we close this whole loop, starts with suffering, recognizing the clinging that is bound up with suffering, seeing how when the clinging itself is released, there's a sense of relief and openness and ease and comfort, and then allowing that to become this kind of virtuous cycle that goes over and over again, deeper and deeper, all aspects of your life. The way to get there, of course, is the fourth noble truth, the Eightfold Noble Path. So actually contemplating the Eightfold Noble Path in its components can be very helpful in troubleshooting your own practice. So if you look at, say, the first couple of factors. So the Noble Path is often sort of categorized into sila, samadhi, and panya. So virtuous action, right? In effect, the wisdom is what we want. That's the point of it. We're not trying to meditate just for the sake of meditation. We're doing these things for the sake of liberation, for awakening. And liberation to what? Liberation to freedom of heart and mind, no longer being caught up in the painful habits that cause suffering. Awakening to what? Awakening to the truth of the way things actually are, rather than the way we think they should be, or that we fear that they might be, or that we suppose that they are. We actually see for ourselves how the mind works, how it creates suffering, and how it's possible to let it go. This is the letting go of ignorance, the ceasing of ignoring the truth. So the wisdom at the end of the path, so it seems, sila, samadhi, panya, virtuous action, meditation, concentration, and wisdom. The wisdom at the end of the path is the wisdom of the Buddha. It's the understanding of the truth of the way things are. And embodied in that wisdom is the ability to regularly, consistently recognize the causes of suffering and let them go. Right? When you recognize the causes of suffering and let them go, of course, where you're abiding in the peace and ease of the freedom of the Buddha. This process is cyclical. It develops over time. It gets stronger. It creates like a virtuous cycle that becomes more and more pervasive. And it depends on all those factors of the Eightfold Noble Path. So the traditional way of putting it is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right mindfulness, right concentration. And did I get them all? I think I did. Let's go through that again. Right view, right right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right. Oh, I know I left one out. Right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So effort's important, but not just effort for the sake of effort, not just like trying really hard, because sometimes our training can be, or our conditioning can be that trying really hard, just really putting forth a lot of effort, is a way of trying to get what we want. So it's a way of trying to control things. It's one of those habits of mind that can be an aspect of clinging. So that's what the Buddha uses the term right when he talks about these things. It's not just any kind of mindfulness or any kind of concentration or any kind of effort. It's the right, sort of the kind of the light touch, the perceptive or wise application of effort that allows us to put enough effort in without too much. So I kind of got pulled into talking about effort because each one of the aspects of the Noble Path can bear a lot of reflection and consideration and cross-examination of yourself. Have I really understood this aspect of the Noble Path? Am I applying it consistently in my practice? Is this a kind of a blind spot or a weak spot? And if you feel like you don't really quite get some aspect of the Eightfold Noble Path, then it's well worth your time to investigate it more carefully, to try to understand it both in terms of like academic study, reading about it, and to understand it in terms of how it manifests in practice. And so then that brings us back to what we're doing right now. We're sitting in a community, we're sharing words of Dhamma, we're experiencing what's called Kalyana Mita, noble friends and noble companions, spirit friends. And this is one of the main supports for our spiritual practice. Is we can't really do this alone. We do this as part of a community of people who are practicing, and so take full advantage of it. We're kind of all here for each other. We all want the same thing. We all want to experience peace and peace. And this is our noble duty as Buddhist practitioners.